Trump's trade war with Canada isn't going according to plan, and the cracks are starting to show. While the former reality TV host turned president continues to threaten America's closest ally with punishing tariffs, the strategy that was supposed to bring Canada to its knees is instead revealing the fundamental weakness of Trump's economic bullying tactics. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc just delivered a message that should worry Trump. The tariffs deal hasn't hit a dead end. But what LeBlanc didn't say might be even more telling, because behind the diplomatic language lies a story of American businesses suffering, supply chains cracking, and Trump's own supporters turning against his tariff obsession. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. When Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he immediately launched what he called a war on drugs and illegal immigration. His weapon of choice? Tariffs, lots of them. In February, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on virtually all imports from Canada and Mexico, claiming it was necessary to stem the flow of fentanyl and illegal border crossings. The problem? There's virtually no evidence that Canada is a major supplier of fentanyl to the United States. In fact, Canadian officials seized more drugs coming from the U.S. than American authorities captured flowing north. But Trump wasn't done. By July, he had escalated those tariffs to 35%. His economic strategy became crystal clear when he declared that America doesn't need Canadian-made cars, preferring to manufacture them in Detroit instead.
We don't need their cars. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit.
Trying to force more businesses to build in the U.S. as central theme of why Trump keeps slapping more tariffs on different goods. The latest set to come into place on October 14th. A 25% tariff on cabinets and furniture, and a 10% tariff on lumber. That's on top of the other levies that already total 35% on Canadian softwood.
Having 45%, effectively tax on your exports to the U.S. Is a significant burden.
A key difference with these tariffs, there's no...
This October, new tariffs came into effect. 25% on cabinets and furniture, 10% on lumber, adding to existing 35% levies on Canadian softwood. The result? A crushing 45% tax burden on key Canadian exports to the United States. Just this week, Trump announced new Section 232 tariffs on lumber, kitchen cabinets, and furniture, arguing that Canadian wood products somehow pose a national security threat to America. It's the kind of logic that would make even Trump's most ardent supporters scratch their heads, if they weren't too busy dealing with the economic consequences of his trade antrum. Meanwhile, at the 2025 Progress Summit in London, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a declaration that sent shockwaves through Washington. Standing alongside UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Carney announced that Canada will never again place its future in American hands.
He dismissed backward-looking politics with a warning. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Tonight, we break down Carney's powerful remarks, his call for independence from U.S. reliance, and what this seismic shift in the global system could mean for Canada's future. Carney began by reflecting on what Canadians felt in the last election, a deep sense of lost control. Inflation was climbing, migration was mishandled, and then came the biggest shock, U.S. tariffs. For Carney, this was the sharpest reminder of Canada's vulnerability. Decades of reliance on Washington had left the country exposed. When Trump's tariffs hit, the truth was undeniable. A single decision in the White House could upend millions of Canadian livelihoods.
He dismissed backward-looking politics with a warning that nostalgia is not a strategy, and introduced his vision of Canada Strong, declaring that the old world order is finished. Carney addressed the shock of U.S. tariffs as the sharpest reminder of Canada's vulnerability, explaining how decades of reliance on Washington left Canada exposed. His response was decisive. Redirect tariff revenues into Canadian workers, jobs, and retraining. His message was clear. Canada will not be bullied. The tensions escalated further when Trump made his most controversial statement yet. During discussions about missile defense cooperation, the president suggested that Canada should become America's 51st state.
We call the Golden Dome Missile Defense Shield. It'll be the most sophisticated in the world. You watched it do well until they had some problems at the end with a little bit of a lack of ammunition, defensive ammunition, but they've got that taken care of. But I tell you, it's what we're doing is so good, and we deserve it. You know, we help other countries with it. We don't have it ourselves. And Canada called me a couple of weeks ago. They want to be part of it. To which I said, well, why don't you just join our country? You become 51, become the 51st state.
This wasn't just casual banter. Trump has repeated this suggestion multiple times, complicating diplomatic relations at the worst possible moment. Here's where Trump's strategy starts falling apart. Prime Minister Carney and Trump had agreed to reach some sort of trade deal by August, a deadline both sides blew past spectacularly. Since then, the pressure has only mounted, but not in the direction Trump expected. Instead of Canada capitulating to American demands, it's American businesses that are feeling the squeeze. LeBlanc pointed to companies like Ford Motors, which relies heavily on Canadian aluminum to build its popular F-150 trucks. Quebec alone supplies 65% of America's aluminum imports, according to the Aluminum Association of Canada. When Trump slaps tariffs on Canadian aluminum, he's not punishing Canada. He's punishing American manufacturers who suddenly find their production costs skyrocketing. Ford's margins are getting crushed, and they're not happy about it. This isn't just about big corporations either. CBC News has spoken to smaller U.S. manufacturers and importers who are facing massive cost overruns because of these tariffs. They're lobbying Trump directly, begging him to change course. The very businesses that were supposed to benefit from Trump's America First policies are instead getting hammered by his trade war. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand has revealed Canada's strategic response to this crisis. She emphasizes that Canada is doubling down on multilateral relationships in defense, security, and economy. Recent trade agreements with Indonesia, Mexico, and the EU demonstrate this approach. Importantly, she stresses that 75 to 80% of Canada's trade with the U.S. continues under existing agreements, while Canada works to diversify its economic partnerships to reduce reliance on a single trading partner.
Any particular tariff measure that the United States is adopting, we are, of course, working for the benefit of the Canadian economy. One of the points in the speech that I made at the UN General Assembly today is, in fact, about our economic resilience at home. Canada is doubling down on our multilateral relationships, not only in defense and security, but also in areas of the economy, such as the WTO. We are forging new economic partnerships with partners. I cited the trade agreement with Indonesia last week, Mexico, and further efforts in the EU, for example. So this is all hands on deck for Canada in terms of defense and security, in terms of economic resilience, as well as, of course, standing up for our core values.
Let me drill down on that, because that's sort of a focus of the speech that you delivered, right? Here are the three planks of our foreign policy as we put it forth. Defense and security, as you mentioned, the second, economic resilience, and the third, core values. I want to pick up on the economic resilience part, because you gave some examples in Mexico, Indonesia, and in Europe. Your opposition at this moment in time says that you're essentially conveying something that isn't true, that in Indonesia's case, for example, that
LeBlanc is banking on this domestic pressure to create what he calls an opportunity for us to come to an agreement with the American administration that's in the interest of both economies. Translation: Trump's own supporters are turning against him, and Canada is just waiting for the political pressure to become unbearable. But here's the most damaging part for Trump. Canada has found a way to largely bypass his tariff threats. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement, the trade deal Trump himself negotiated and signed in his first term, contains provisions that allow most Canadian goods to enter the U.S. tariff-free if they're CUSMA compliant. Around 86% of Canadian exports to the U.S. can potentially qualify for this exemption. This means Trump's big, scary tariff threats are largely toothless against the majority of Canadian trade. While he pounds his chest about 35% tariffs, most Canadian exporters can simply fill out some paperwork, prove their goods meet North American content requirements, and walk right past Trump's tariff wall. It's like building a fence with a giant gate in the middle and then acting surprised when people use the gate. The irony is delicious. Trump is using a trade agreement he negotiated to protect Canadian exporters from tariffs he imposed to punish Canada. It's the kind of self-defeating circular logic that perfectly encapsulates the chaos of Trump's economic policy. Meanwhile, Canada has been playing a much smarter game. Initially, Carney imposed retaliatory tariffs on American goods, hitting everything from oranges to motorcycles with 25% duties. But in August, after Canada and the US reached a partial understanding, Carney announced he would remove most of these counter tariffs, aligning with the CUSMA exemptions that protect Canadian goods. Conservative critics called it capitulation, but the move was actually strategically brilliant. By matching US exemptions, Canada demonstrated it was willing to de-escalate while simultaneously highlighting the absurdity of Trump's position. Canada was essentially saying, "We'll follow the rules of the trade deal you signed, if you will." The result? Canada maintained access to the US market for the vast majority of its exports while removing the economic burden of higher prices on Canadian consumers. Trump, meanwhile, is left with tariffs that primarily hurt American businesses and consumers while failing to achieve any of his stated policy goals. As Carney declared at the Progress Summit, what the world is experiencing is not a transition but a rupture. The old order of trade and geopolitics is gone. He posed the critical question, who adapts and who gets left behind? Carney's answer is unequivocal. Canada will adapt, Canada will lead, and Canada will stand strong on the world stage.
We're not going back. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Carney declared that what the world is living through is not a transition, but a rupture. The old order of trade and geopolitics is gone. The real question now is simple. Who adapts and who gets left behind? Carney's answer was clear. Canada will adapt, Canada will lead, and Canada will stand strong. The Progress Summit wasn't just another gathering of leaders. It was Carney's stage to send a direct warning to Trump, to Washington, and to Canadians themselves. Our future cannot depend on the United States. Instead, Carney laid out a vision of a country that builds a home, diversifies abroad, and partners only with nations that share its values. Canada Strong is not just a slogan. It is a survival strategy. And with it begins a new chapter, one where Canada steps.
LeBlanc's confidence that the talks haven't reached a dead end reflects this strategic position. Canada doesn't need to make major concessions because it has already found ways to work around Trump's tariffs. The pressure is entirely on the American side, where businesses are demanding relief and consumers are paying higher prices. This dynamic becomes even more important as the CUSMA review approaches in 2026. Trump has indicated he wants to renegotiate the entire agreement, but Canada's successful navigation of the current trade tensions puts it in a much stronger position for those talks. By demonstrating that it can maintain trade flows despite Trump's threats, Canada has shown it has options. There's also the broader geopolitical context to consider. While Trump wages his trade war against America's closest allies, other countries are watching and learning. The European Union struck a deal with Trump that still leaves them facing 10% baseline tariffs. Vietnam ended its negotiations, accepting 20% levies. These precedents suggest that any deal Trump offers will include permanent tariffs, exactly what LeBlanc said Canada will not accept. The minister was crystal clear: Canada will not accept any deal with a baseline tariff. This isn't just negotiating posture, it's recognition that accepting permanent tariffs would fundamentally alter the relationship between the two countries and set a precedent that could encourage further economic bullying. Trump's tariff strategy is also running into legal challenges. Federal courts have already struck down some of his broader tariff programs, and the Supreme Court is reviewing the legality of his reciprocal tariffs on global trading partners. If these legal challenges succeed, much of Trump's tariff architecture could collapse, leaving him with even less leverage in negotiations with Canada. The economic data tells the story Trump doesn't want to admit. Despite his claims that tariffs are the most beautiful word in the dictionary, they're functioning as a tax on American consumers and businesses. When Ford pays more for Canadian aluminum, those costs get passed on to American truck buyers. When small manufacturers face higher input costs, they either absorb the losses or raise prices for their customers. Meanwhile, Canada's economy has proven remarkably resilient. The CUSMA exemptions have allowed most Canadian exporters to maintain their market access, while the government's targeted support for affected industries has helped cushion any negative impacts. Canada's retaliatory tariffs, before they were lifted, generated revenue that was used to support Canadian businesses and workers. Perhaps most importantly, Trump's trade war has accelerated Canada's efforts to diversify its trade relationships. While the U.S. remains Canada's largest trading partner, the uncertainty created by Trump's policies has pushed Canadian businesses to explore new markets and reduce their dependence on American consumers. In the long run, this diversification makes Canada less vulnerable to future trade disputes and reduces Trump's leverage. LeBlanc's optimism about reaching a deal reflects this stronger negotiating position. Canada can afford to wait for a better offer because it has found ways to maintain most of its trade flows despite Trump's tariffs. The pressure is on Trump to deliver results for American businesses that are suffering under his policies. The timing is also working in Canada's favor. As Trump approaches the midpoint of his term, his approval ratings have taken a hit, with polling showing that tariffs are a major factor in declining public support. American voters are starting to connect higher prices at the store with Trump's trade policies, creating political pressure for him to find face-saving ways to reduce tariffs. This political dynamic is exactly what LeBlanc was referring to when he mentioned pressure from senators, governors, business, and union leaders in the United States. Trump's own Republican allies are starting to question whether the tariff strategy is working, especially as they hear complaints from businesses and constituents in their home states. The lumber tariffs announced this week are a perfect example of how Trump's policies hurt his own supporters. Canadian lumber is essential for American home building, and the new tariffs will drive up housing costs at a time when affordability is already a major political issue. American homebuilders, who tend to support Republican candidates, are furious about policies that make their business more expensive. Similarly, the tariffs on kitchen cabinets and furniture hit American retailers and consumers directly. These aren't products where American manufacturers can easily replace Canadian suppliers. The supply chains are integrated across the border, and disrupting them creates costs and delays that ultimately fall on American businesses and consumers. Trump's use of Section 232 national security tariffs for these products is particularly problematic because it stretches the legal justification beyond recognition. It's one thing to argue that steel and aluminum imports affect national security. It's quite another to claim that kitchen cabinets pose a threat to America's defense capabilities. This kind of legal overreach makes Trump's tariff programs more vulnerable to court challenges. The broader pattern is clear. Trump's tariff strategy is creating more problems than it solves, while Canada has found ways to minimize the damage and maintain its economic interests. LeBlanc's confidence that talks can continue productively reflects this reality. Canada doesn't need to panic because it has successfully navigated the worst of Trump's trade tantrum. Looking ahead, the 2026 CUSMA review will be the real test of this relationship. Trump has already indicated he wants major changes to the agreement, potentially including permanent tariffs and restrictions on Canadian industries like supply management and agriculture. But Canada's successful management of the current crisis puts it in a much stronger position for those negotiations. The key insight from LeBlanc's comments is that Canada has learned to work around Trump's unpredictability rather than trying to appease it. By maintaining access to U.S. markets through CUSMA compliance while building alternative relationships and strengthening domestic industries, Canada has reduced its vulnerability to Trump's economic bullying. This approach stands in stark contrast to other countries that have made major concessions to secure deals with Trump, only to find themselves facing continued pressure and threats. Canada's refusal to accept baseline tariffs sends a clear message that it won't be intimidated into accepting a fundamentally altered relationship. The irony of Trump's position is that his own trade deal provides the framework for Canada to resist his tariff threats. Every time a Canadian company proves CUSMA compliance and ships goods tariff-free to the U.S., It's a reminder that Trump's negotiating position is undermined by his own previous agreements. As LeBlanc noted, time will tell whether his optimism about reaching a deal is justified. But the underlying dynamics strongly favor Canada's patient approach over Trump's erratic threats and demands. American businesses need Canadian inputs, American consumers benefit from Canadian goods, and American politicians are feeling pressure from constituents who are paying the price for Trump's trade war. The real question isn't whether Canada will cave to Trump's demands, it's whether Trump can find a face-saving way to back down from policies that are hurting his own country more than they're helping. LeBlanc's confidence suggests that Canada is prepared to wait as long as necessary for Trump to reach that realization. And given the mounting evidence that Trump's tariff strategy is backfiring, that moment may come sooner than the former reality TV host expects.